Hello, hello, my sweeties, and welcome to another episode of Oh My Anime Podcast. This is your host, Mimi Hime, and today we'll be talking about representation in anime. With it being the final Saturday of Black History Month, I felt like having an episode about representation in the anime community, in anime culture, and anime was super important because I feel like it's a conversation that we don't have enough. I feel like it's a conversation that needs to be had, that a lot of us want to have, that we don't have the platforms to have in a sort of critical and constructive sphere. So, if anything, if there's anything anyone can take away from my podcast, I do want to be able to have these kinds of, important conversations, every now and then. I don't want this to become a political podcast or anything like that, but, it is important to talk about these things. And as a Black nerd myself, it's a topic that's extremely relatable. It's something that I experience. It's something that I've been experiencing since I joined the anime community back in 2006, which was middle school for me. So, I think representation really does matter, even if it is from other countries, right? And I think that's where I really want to start, where a lot of the times when we have these conversations and when there are these debates about is this wrong or is this inappropriate representation, a lot of people they don't really take into consideration the context, because I feel like the context is what makes a lot of these situations not as black and white as maybe people want to make them out to be. Because at the end of the day, while most, if not all, countries that have individuals with different complexions, lighter complexions to darker complexions. For all of the countries, that have that in their society, there has almost always been the sort of stigma of who is more beautiful, who is more worthy, who is, who do we want to represent what our nation and our people look like. And in most cases, it is the darker complexions that get the short end of the stick. They do not get those same rights. They do not get those same privileges. They are not treated as equals, and instead are treated as less than or as others. But just because that dynamic has, predominantly existed throughout history, individuals' acceptance of that, each country's understanding of that, each history's events and activities and history surrounding that is different, right? So not every country has no other country has American history. No other country has, French history or Japanese history. And so when these other countries, create media that have individuals from other backgrounds, some of the stigmas that we as Black Americans feel, have experienced, our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, etc., some of those stigmas and some of those experiences are not the experiences and are not the histories and the lived experiences of, dark or more melanated individuals in Asian countries and European countries and things like that. And this is not for me to sort of be an apologist, right? I'm not saying that because they haven't had our history that they're allowed to inappropriately represent individuals in media. That is not what I'm trying to say. However, there have been lots of incidents, throughout my time in the anime community where there have been, complete and utter, gosh, I don't really even know how to phrase it, but there have been, a lot of infighting and a lot of discussions about what is appropriate representation of characters in shows, what does it mean? What is the what are the origins of that character design, I guess is where I'm going. And, I think a lot of people are like, well, they should have researched more. But I almost think it's sort of haughty, and it's very cocky and almost arrogant to think that every depiction of a melanated person is somehow always supposed to be Black American or African. Like there are other melanated individuals in the world. So to assume that when we see a melanated individual in a show, unless that character is, explicitly identified as coming from a certain continent or a certain ethnic background, to assume it is yours and then to criticize a character's design or mannerisms based off an assumption that you're making, and an assumption of what the creator's intentions for that character were, I think is pretty arrogant. So I guess what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say, there have been a lot of discussions about, like, is this character representation blackface? One of the first instances I can remember that conversation coming up was with Mr. Popo in Dragon Ball. And people attributed his Mr. Popo wasn't even a human character. He was humanoid, but he was an alien. As far as I'm concerned, for the purposes of this podcast, he was not human. He was an alien. He was a foreign entity, foreign, in the sense that not from this world entity. But obviously, Mr. Popo's character design, I can remember his character being pitch black, and then he had the really big lips, and the wide eyes. I'm thinking of this off the top of my head. I don't recall him having a nose, but I definitely remember the big lips, and he had really, really dark, black skin. I remember there being discussions about whether that was a representation of blackface, and at that time I was much, much younger, so I didn't know as much about anything race related as much then as I do now, but I remember back then being pretty confused because I was like, Mr. Popo didn't dress like a quote black person, right? He had the turban. His clothes were, to me, very Arabic looking, Middle Eastern looking. Look, I don't really remember exactly what I thought, but I didn't really attribute, in my young mind, I didn't attribute him as looking black, per se. But then again, I don't know. As a young kid, I just wasn't looking for those things. But I just remember the discussions being had in forums that I was, seeing on the internet and stuff. And I don't know. And then I do remember his skin kind of got changed to blue, I think it was. So there's stuff like that. And then there are plenty, of other, melanated individuals in anime where people questioned their lip size or their hair or just obviously character features that were stereotypically used to depict African Americans in American society. And so then people would sort of say, well, this is racist or this is poor representation and things like that. And so, I don't know. I certainly think there's, merit to those kinds of academic discussions and discourse. But I personally, I don't know enough about the kind of research or intentionality that, Japanese animators and authors and directors put into when they look at a character design, I don't know if when they design characters, I just don't think in my head that they're designing to per se an American audience. That's just not what I think. I mean, and I'm more than happy to be challenged in that mindset, but I just find it very hard a lot of the times to think that when they create characters of color, I just have a very hard time thinking that they're intentionally designing characters with American history in mind, and looking at American stereotypes and things like that, and then intentionally pulling from those. And maybe it's more that I think some people were saying, well, they look at American art of certain individuals and ethnicities, and then they, pull that as as a reference point, which I suppose is possible. And once again, I don't know. It's not like I did extensive research on this topic before I picked this episode. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. I mean, and that's possible, but then I just question, I don't know if, when characters are being designed, and they're getting references from other countries, if they're necessarily looking up whether those references that they've collected were accepted positively or negatively by a certain group of people, in that country. So I don't know. I think it's definitely something that I should probably look into more, but I just, in my own personal opinion, I just don't necessarily believe that character designers in Japan are like, wow, we're going to design this, melanated female character and put pigtails in her hair and put the red bows at the end, and give her slightly bigger lips, to throw back to the old way in which, white Americans depicted young black girls. I don't think that is their intention, or and maybe they're naive, who knows, it's possible. I just don't go into many situations assuming the worst of people. It's just not in my nature to do so. However, I think then it kind of goes into the sort of next topic of representation. Is any representation good representation? And I would say the answer is no. Not all representation is good representation, because that's where you get into appropriation or tokenism, fetishizing, things like that. So I don't think just being present is necessarily a good thing. You need to be present with intentionality. You need to be present with critical thought put into it. And so I want to be represented appropriately, in a way that I feel proud of that representation. And keeping in mind that there is no group of people that have all positives within their race, right? There are good and bad of everyone, because everyone is their own person, no matter what group they fall into based off of the color of their skin. And so I think keeping that in mind too, that just because, a person is a thug in one show doesn't mean they should be a thug in all shows, but there are thugs. And just because, a certain ethnicity is made a maid or farmer or educator or doctor in one show doesn't mean they should always be represented that way in all other shows, because, that's the stereotype attributed to that race or ethnicity or cultural background. Things like that, right? Like, those people exist in every race and every cultural background. So to see it in one place is okay, and see it in a few places is okay, because that's realistic. That happens. But to see it everywhere, to see it reoccurring, to see it perpetuated, that's when it also becomes an issue. And so, I have lots of, dark-skinned anime characters that I really love, that I have always loved, from the moment I saw them on the screen. So, some of the shows that I, think back on fondly that had, dark-skinned people in it that I genuinely loved. You know, I have to give it to Yoruichi Shihon from Bleach. She's probably one of the earliest memories of a dark-skinned character that I ever saw. You know, she's from the Soul Society, so she's not, you know, she's not African American. She's dark-skinned, she's black, but, you know, she's not from Africa. She's not from, you know, South America. She's from Soul Society, a totally fictional location. And then the Soul Society happens to correspond with Japan, but that doesn't necessarily make her Japanese. So I remember loving her character. I remember loving her intelligence, her wittiness. I loved the fact that she was so badass and so respected and revered, but yet still so relatable and so down to earth, despite her origin story of essentially being royalty and things like that. I really loved that about her. I kind of do look back and get a little frustrated that she was a black cat for so long, and that can kind of take me on a completely different tangent about, like, you know, American films, especially, that tend to have, you know, lead people of color and then they're animals for a majority of the movie, but I won't go down that tangent too far. Other dark-skinned characters in anime that I have really loved over the years, I really loved in Code Geass. We had not just one, we had quite a few dark-skinned characters, but the two that predominantly obviously stood out to me were some, you know, the main ones, which was Rakshata, who was this, you know, brilliant scientist who essentially helped run the Black Knights, but her nationality was Indian, which is fine, but, you know, she was dark-skinned, and I loved her, and she was beautiful, and people called her beautiful, and respected her for her intelligence and her ideas, and she was confident, and she carried herself with grace and elegance, and I loved that about Rakshata. I'm not going to go through all of them. I guess the last one that I'll really talk about is Michiko Melandro and Atsuko Jackson from Michiko to Hatchin. And their nationality is Brazilian, actually. The show makes it pretty clear that even though it takes place in Brazil, it's a very, like, fantastical, twisted, like, skewed alternate universe of Brazil. Just because there are, like, some, like, I guess, like, food items that aren't obviously quite there. And I think they messed with, like, the geography of Brazil a little bit in the show. But regardless, they identified as Brazil. So they're Brazilian. But, I mean, Michiko's character design was intentionally based off of Aaliyah, the R&B icon, R&B princess, as many call her. So Michiko is actually directly related to Aaliyah, who we all know and love. And then there's Atsuko, who has this, like, big blonde afro that she rocks the entire series. It's great. And so I love them. That entire show, Michiko to Hatchin, it's actually predominantly a dark-skinned cast. Most of the characters are melanated individuals. There's, you know, obviously a balance of some, you know, non-melanated people in the show, but Michiko to Hatchin, I think, was one of the first shows I saw where a majority of the cast was melanated, and I remember really loving that. It's one of my favorite shows now. It's a show that I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it. Once again, it's called Michiko to Hatchin. It used to be on Funimation. I don't know if it's on their app or whatever anymore, but I know that Funimation is the one who, you know, serialized it. So if you go to buy the disc, it would be through Funimation. So let's see. So then the next thing I guess we would move on to is, okay, so there's not a whole lot. I mean, over the years, there have been more and more shows that sort of have some of their sort of tokenized but not tokenized, black dark skinned characters in them. Fire Force has quite a few now. And let's see, what other shows am I watching that have some, I think The Promised Neverland has some kids in it that have, some melanin in their system. And I think Attack on Titan, just showed quite a few dark skinned people suddenly showing up from like Marley and stuff. So, we're showing up, but we're obviously just not widely represented, right? And that's okay in the sense that, once again, if we're going to show up, I want us to show up with a meaning. I don't want us to just be tossed in there so that we can, our group, black nerds can be appeased, right? I definitely don't want that. I want it to have meaning and substance to it. But it sort of then leads into some issues we have in the anime community where a lot of people, especially from many Asian communities, but not just Asian communities, white communities, etc., that get really, really upset when black or people of color cosplayers cosplay characters that are not originally melanated. So for instance, if a person were to cosplay Ichigo or Sailor Moon, Goku, what have you, a character that's not melanated, and when people of color decide that they want to cosplay those characters, whether it be as accurate as possible or doing a slight, alteration to the hair to accommodate their own hairstyle, because not everyone enjoys wearing wigs or has the space for tons of different wigs if they do a lot of different cosplays. I mean, we have to get past that. Like, these characters are fictional, and so whatever twist, whatever fan art version that people want to make, I think there has to be that room for creative freedom and creative expression, obviously within bounds, because some people took it way too far. When I think about the fan art issue we had with our girl Nessa and Pokemon, and someone was like, oh, I'm gonna draw her as a gorilla, that was obviously and intentionally racist. But no, I don't have an issue with people changing the skin complexion and fan art and stuff, as long as it's meant to be fan art and it's meant to be like, oh, look at the different options of what she could look like. Because I mean, people of color, we have darkened the skin of different characters so that we could relate to them before. So I don't see an issue necessarily with people lightening characters. And I know people will say, but they have so many characters, why would they lighten ours? That debate, I feel like there's just a lot of complexity to it. I do not think it's a black and white situation, merely because, once again, not every country has the wounds and scars and systematic issues that America has, right? And so to sort of demand that every other country and its people, cater to our hurt and our pain and our struggle and our oppression in that way, I don't necessarily agree that type of creative freedom is necessarily saying that they don't, they're not in solidarity with us. But there is nothing wrong with, for me as a black nerd to cosplay as Sailor Moon. If I choose to buy a blonde wig and style it, great. But if I choose to use my own hair and put it into puffballs, there's nothing wrong with that either. And I shouldn't be called the ghetto version or the, like the ghetto version or the hood version of Sailor Moon for it. No, I am cosplaying my version of Sailor Moon. You see the costume, you see the outfit, you see the clothes, you see everything. You know who exactly I'm cosplaying. And so it shouldn't have some other derogatory adjective added to it just because of the color of my skin. And so I think it's important that people realize that we don't have a lot of characters that we can cosplay as, and so to then tell us that we can only cosplay characters that look like us is more of an insult to injury that there aren't more characters that look like us. And that's why it is important that there be more representation in anime, because we want characters to cosplay too, but at the end of the day, like, they're all fictional characters. We should all be able to cosplay anyone. And, you know, and then I guess it kind of gets into the area of, like, should Asian cosplayers or, you know, light-skinned cosplayers be allowed to use makeup to darken their skin to look like, you know, the dark-skinned character that they're cosplaying as. Personally, and I know this is controversial, personally, I don't have a solid stance on that, for the exact reason that I've been stating throughout this podcast. Not every country shares the same history of blackface that American history has, right? And so, yes, as an American, as a Black American who has struggled with, you know, American society as a whole, accepting, you know, dark skin is beautiful, Black people is beautiful, our features is beautiful, our hair is beautiful, things like that. All of that pain and all of that struggle is not shared by the masses abroad. And so, with that context, I just, once again, have a very hard time being like, well, they can't darken their skin because that is blackface. But their country doesn't have that history. And so once I just struggle. I just struggle with that. And you know, if anyone would like to send me papers, research or anything, or articles or whatever, more about that, so that I can create a more solid opinion about that or whatever, I'm always happy to be, you know, constructively critiqued. I'm always happy to receive feedback. I'm always happy to read more about it. But right now, my stance is I don't know. I really handle these situations on a case by case situation, because I don't know. I have a very hard time. I usually don't I usually just try to avoid the topic altogether, but I felt like for the sake of this podcast, it was important for me to at least acknowledge that that is an issue for a lot of people, and I understand that pain, I understand that struggle. I just don't know if I necessarily agree that it's wrong when it's coming from individuals who are abroad. I think the only time that I'm intentionally mindful, or how should I put it? The only time that I usually blatantly am against it is if I know that person has some sort of bias against dark-skinned people. So it's like, oh, you don't mind dressing up as us, but you don't actually support us. You don't actually do anything to actively help us become equals in your community. Things like that. If it's a person who's literally doing it for clout and is actively, you know, racist, that's when I have an issue. But other than that, if it really is just for being, you know, as close to that character representation as possible, and, you know, there's sort of no racist undertones of it, then usually I don't really care. I kind of just scroll past it. So anyway, just to sort of tie this whole episode together, representation in anime is important. It's important because all of us who engage in the anime community and the culture, we want to see ourselves too. And I think at the end of the day, people need to remember this is fiction. This is not real. So how is it that even in not real, fantastical plot lines and premises, that people can't have dark skin, right? It doesn't really make sense. Why do they always have to be light-skinned, right? There's no reason really other than bias, right? And comfort, or things like that. There's no reason that there can't be more than one dark-skinned character. And I know it has a lot to do with who the target audience is, but representation is just such a huge thing for a lot of people. Everyone wants to see themselves in the medium that they love, in the fandom that they love. And not all of these shows take place in Japan, right? I perfectly understand the slice of life shows where, it takes place in Japan, and yes, Japan is a very, homogenous country. Certain parts aren't as homogenous as others, but still, Japan is a very homogenous country. Asian countries tend to be pretty homogenous, but not all of these shows that we watch take place in Japan. They don't take place in this realm of reality, right? They take place in these fictional worlds, these fictional dystopian post-apocalyptic worlds, these fantastical worlds, these other worlds where they get, transported to other places with magic and dragons and stuff. And it's like, well, why can't we exist in those magical worlds too, right? We just want to be included. That's really all that it comes to. I want to see myself in a character that gets to explore dungeons, that gets to learn about runes, that gets to be a vampire, that gets to be a mage, that gets to be whatever everyone else gets to be, both in positive and negative lights. I'm not saying I always want to, I'm not saying that, once again, I'm not saying that all characters have to be represented in the best light in the show. Like, they can be good, they can be evil, whatever. I don't think that, I just don't think that representation is that hard. Especially in this day and age, it's not that hard to change the complexion of a character. We can all do it in Photoshop with ease, or Procreate, or whatever, art software you have access to. It's just not that difficult. It's not. And I'm tired of people pretending like it's difficult to incorporate representation and diversity into their shows, because it isn't. And, I just want our community to come together and really realize that it's not an us versus them situation. All of us can cosplay. All of us can be happy and enjoy a character, no matter what their complexion is. And so I just, with this being the last weekend of Black History Month, I thought it was really important that I bring this up on my podcast. So anyway, that is all. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I love you all so much. And until next time, my sweeties, goodbye.